Hey, tonight we're diving into something that will completely change how you see that kitchen knife in your drawer or the hammer in your garage. We're going back to a time when making the wrong tool choice didn't just mean a bad day at work, it meant you didn't eat. Or worse, something else ate you. We're talking about 4.7 million years ago, when our ancestors were crafting the very first weapons that would literally shape human evolution. If you're enjoying this journey through deep time, I'd really appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It helps more than you know. I'm always curious where you all are watching from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these ancient stories. Now, settle in, maybe dim the lights, and let's travel back to an Africa that would be completely unrecognizable to us today. We're going to explore how a desperate need for better tools turned our ancestors into the most dangerous predators the planet had ever seen. Picture this, you've just opened your eyes 4.7 million years ago in the heart of Africa. The good news is you're alive and part of a small group of early hominins struggling to survive in a world that wants to kill you. The bad news is literally everything else. Your hands are your primary tools, your teeth are your backup weapons, and your survival depends on making split-second decisions that our modern brains can barely comprehend. The landscape around you isn't the Africa of today's documentaries. This is the Pliocene epoch, a time when the climate was warming, forests were shrinking, and vast savannas were expanding across the continent. Where dense woodlands once provided shelter and abundant fruit, now endless grasslands stretch to the horizon, broken only by scattered groves of acacia trees and seasonal rivers that might dry up for months at a time. You're not alone out here. The African savanna is crawling with predators that make today's wildlife look tame. Saber-toothed cats the size of modern lions patrol the grasslands, their massive canine teeth designed to puncture the thick hides of megafauna. Giant hyenas, some weighing over 400 pounds, hunt in packs and can crush bones that would stop a modern leopard. Crocodiles, 20 feet long, lurk in every river and waterhole, while enormous birds of prey with wingspans reaching 12 feet patrol the skies above. And then there's the competition from other early human species. You're sharing this harsh environment with multiple hominin groups, each fighting for the same scarce resources. Australopithecus afarensis, the species that includes the famous Lucy fossil, is struggling to adapt to life on the ground after millions of years of tree-dwelling ancestors. These early humans stand barely 4 feet tall, with brains about the size of a modern chimpanzee, but they're facing challenges no chimp ever encountered. The shift from forest to savanna wasn't gradual. Archaeological evidence suggests that climate change happened rapidly during this period, forcing early hominins to adapt or die. Those dense forests that had provided protection, food, and nesting sites were disappearing within just a few generations. Suddenly, these early humans found themselves exposed on open grasslands, with nowhere to hide, and a completely different set of survival challenges. Food was scarce and dangerous to obtain. The fruits and leaves that had sustained their ancestors were now scattered across vast distances, often defended by territorial animals, or growing in locations that exposed foragers to predator attacks. Plant foods that were available were often tough, fibrous, and required extensive processing to be digestible. Meanwhile, the expanding grasslands supported huge herds of animals, but these weren't the docile prey our ancestors could simply overwhelm with numbers. The megafauna of this period were massive and dangerous. Giant antelopes with horns like spears roamed in herds. Enormous elephants, larger than their modern descendants, moved in protective family groups. Even the smaller animals were formidable. Early horses were stockier and more aggressive than today's breeds, while ancient zebras had powerful kicks that could shatter bones. For early hominins, obtaining meat meant either scavenging from kills made by more powerful predators, or somehow bringing down these dangerous animals themselves. Scavenging was risky business. It meant competing with hyenas, wild dogs, and vultures for access to carcasses, often while the original predator was still nearby. Many early hominin fossils show evidence of predator damage, suggesting that our ancestors were often on the menu themselves. But something remarkable was beginning to happen. Archaeological sites from this period show the first evidence of intentional tool modification. These weren't just rocks picked up and used once, but stones that had been carefully shaped and carried from place to place. The oldest known stone tools, discovered in Ethiopia and Kenya, date back approximately 3.3 million years, but evidence suggests that tool use began much earlier. These first tools were incredibly simple by our standards, but revolutionary for their time. The basic technology involved striking one stone against another to create sharp edges. But even this simple process required sophisticated understanding of rock properties, angle of impact, and force application. Not every stone could be knapped successfully. Early toolmakers had to learn to identify specific types of volcanic glass, flint, and quartzite that would fracture in predictable ways. The cognitive leap required for consistent toolmaking was enormous. Modern experiments with chimpanzees and bonobos show that while our closest relatives can learn to use simple tools, the systematic production of stone tools requires planning, spatial reasoning, and fine motor control that pushes the limits of non-human intelligence. Our early ancestors had to develop the mental capacity to visualize the end product, understand the sequence of actions needed to create it, and maintain focus through the often frustrating process of trial and error. Early tool sites tell fascinating stories of learning and innovation. Archaeologists have found areas littered with failed attempts, broken stones, and gradually improving examples of toolmaking. These sites represent some of humanity's first classrooms, places where knowledge was passed from one generation to the next through demonstration and practice. The social implications were staggering. Toolmaking required cooperation, teaching, and the development of primitive communication systems to share techniques. But why did early hominins need tools in the first place? The answer lies in the fundamental mismatch between their anatomy and their environment. Unlike modern humans, early hominins had relatively small brains, weak jaw muscles, and teeth that were poorly adapted for processing tough foods or tearing meat. Their hands, while more dexterous than those of other primates, lacked the strength to tear apart large carcasses or crack open bones for nutrient-rich marrow. The fossil record shows that early hominins faced serious nutritional challenges. Tooth wear patterns indicate they were eating increasingly tough, abrasive foods. Skeletal remains show signs of nutritional stress, suggesting that finding adequate calories was a constant struggle. In this context, tools weren't luxuries or conveniences. They were life-saving technologies that expanded the range of available food sources. The first hunting weapons were probably not weapons at all, but tools adapted from food processing implements. A sharp stone used to cut meat from bones could also be used to defend against smaller predators or competitors. A heavy rock employed to crack nuts might serve as a projectile when thrown at a threatening animal. This dual-purpose nature of early tools reflects the practical mindset of early humans. Every object had to serve multiple functions in a world where carrying capacity was limited. Evidence from cut-marked bones found at early hominin sites reveals the beginning of systematic butchery practices. These marks, made by stone tools, show that our ancestors were not just scavenging scraps but actively processing entire carcasses. The precision and consistency of these cut marks indicate that early humans had developed specific techniques for efficiently removing meat, accessing marrow, and extracting every possible calorie from their kills. The development of these butchery techniques required remarkable innovation. Early humans had to learn animal anatomy, understanding where to cut to separate joints, how to remove hide without damaging underlying meat, and which bones contained the most nutritious marrow. This knowledge was complex enough that it almost certainly required teaching and practice, contributing to the development of early human culture and social learning. As tool-making skills improved, early hominins began to experiment with different approaches to hunting and food procurement. Simple pointed sticks, sharpened with stone tools, could be used to dig for roots and tubers, or to probe for insects and small animals in burrows. These digging tools opened up entirely new food sources, allowing early humans to access underground storage organs of plants that were rich in carbohydrates and relatively safe from competition with other animals. The psychological impact of tool use on early human development cannot be overstated. For the first time in evolutionary history, a species was systematically modifying its environment rather than simply adapting to it. This shift from passive adaptation to active modification marked the beginning of human technology and the start of our species' journey toward global dominance. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful tool using groups had significant advantages over their non-tool using relatives. Sites associated with advanced tool traditions show evidence of larger group sizes, more diverse diets, and expansion into previously uninhabitable environments. The feedback loop between tool use, brain development, and social cooperation was beginning to accelerate human evolution in ways that would transform not just our species, but the entire planet. The landscape of 4.7 million years ago was about to witness the emergence of something unprecedented in Earth's history. A species that would learn to turn the very stones beneath their feet into extensions of their will, transforming weakness into strength and fear into power. The age of human hunting weapons was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The transformation didn't happen overnight. For hundreds of thousands of years, early hominins fumbled through trial and error, their survival hanging by the thinnest of threads. But around 3.3 million years ago, something clicked. The archaeological record suddenly explodes with evidence of systematic tool production at sites like Lomekwi in Kenya, where researchers discovered stone implements that predate any known human species capable of making them. These weren't accidental discoveries. The precision of the knapping, the consistency of the techniques, and the sheer volume of tools found at these sites tell us that early humans had crossed a cognitive threshold. They weren't just using tools anymore. They were manufacturing them with intention, planning, and an understanding of cause and effect that separated them from every other species on the planet. The Lomekwi tools challenge everything we thought we knew about early human intelligence. These implements required the maker to understand complex geometric relationships, to predict how force applied at specific angles would propagate through different types of stone, and to maintain focus through dozens of precise strikes. Modern attempts to recreate these tools show that even experienced archaeologists need extensive practice to master the techniques our ancestors developed millions of years ago. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating. The tools weren't just getting more sophisticated, they were becoming specialized. Early sites show evidence of different tool types designed for specific tasks. Heavy choppers for breaking bones, sharp scrapers for cleaning hides, pointed implements for piercing and cutting. This specialization indicates that early humans were developing the cognitive capacity for abstract thinking, planning for future needs, and understanding that different problems required different solutions. The social implications were staggering. Toolmaking required raw materials that weren't always available locally. Archaeological evidence shows that early humans were transporting high-quality stones across distances of 50 miles or more, suggesting organized expeditions to quarries and the development of trade relationships between different groups. This movement of materials represents some of the earliest evidence of economic activity in human history. As these tool-making traditions spread across Africa, they began to diverge and evolve. Different regions developed distinct styles and techniques, creating what archaeologists call techno-complexes. The Oldowan tradition, named after Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, became the dominant technology across much of East Africa. These tools were characterized by simple but effective designs that remained virtually unchanged for over 1 million years. The longevity of the Oldowan tradition tells us something profound about early human psychology. These weren't innovators constantly seeking new solutions, but practical survivors who recognized when they had found something that worked. The fact that Oldowan tools remained essentially unchanged for 1 million years suggests that early humans had achieved a technological equilibrium that met their immediate survival needs without requiring constant innovation. However, around 1.8 million years ago, that equilibrium was shattered by the emergence of Homo erectus, a new human species with larger brains and more sophisticated tool-making abilities. These early humans didn't just improve existing tools, they invented entirely new categories of implements that would fundamentally change the nature of hunting and survival. The most revolutionary development was the hand axe, a teardrop-shaped tool that required extraordinary skill to produce. Unlike the simple choppers of earlier traditions, hand axes demanded that the maker envision the final product before beginning work and maintain that vision through hundreds of precise strikes. The symmetry and proportions of these tools suggest that early humans had developed aesthetic sensibilities alongside their practical skills. Hand axes weren't just tools, they were weapons. Their sharp edges could slice through hide and muscle. Their pointed tips could pierce tough materials. Their balanced weight made them effective projectiles when thrown. For the first time, early humans possessed implements specifically designed for violence. Tools that could turn a relatively weak primate into a formidable predator. The archaeological record from this period shows dramatic changes in early human behavior. Kill sites become larger and more organized. Butchery marks on bones show increased efficiency and systematic processing. Evidence of fire use appears at multiple sites, suggesting that early humans were not only killing large animals, but cooking them as well. This combination of improved hunting weapons and fire technology created a feedback loop that would accelerate human evolution. Cooked meat provided more calories with less energy expenditure for digestion, freeing up metabolic resources for brain development. Larger brains enabled more sophisticated tool-making and hunting strategies. Better weapons allowed access to higher quality protein sources, further supporting brain growth. This cycle of technological innovation, dietary improvement, and neurological development was transforming early humans into something unprecedented in evolutionary history. The evidence for organized hunting becomes unmistakable around this time. Sites like Torralba and Ambrona in Spain preserve evidence of coordinated attacks on enormous elephants, creatures that stood 12 feet tall and weighed 8 tons. The kill sites show clear patterns of tool use, butchery sequences, and meat distribution that could only result from planned group activities involving dozens of individuals working together. These weren't opportunistic scavenging events. The positioning of tools, the systematic dismemberment of carcasses, and the evidence of repeated use of the same locations indicates that early humans had developed sophisticated hunting strategies. They were studying animal behavior, identifying migration routes, preparing ambush sites, and coordinating group attacks with a level of planning that approached modern military operations. The weapons themselves were becoming increasingly sophisticated. Wooden spears, hardened in fire and tipped with stone points, extended the reach and penetrating power of early hunters. Throwing sticks and early forms of atlatls multiplied the force that could be applied to projectiles. Stone-tipped arrows, though not yet perfected, were beginning to appear in archaeological contexts, representing humanity's first experiments with truly long-range weapons. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of composite tools, implements made from multiple materials working together to achieve effects impossible with single-component designs. A wooden spear shaft provided flexibility and reach. A stone point concentrated force into a sharp tip. Binding materials held the components together under stress. These composite weapons required understanding of material properties, engineering principles, and manufacturing techniques that pushed early human intelligence to new levels. The psychological transformation was as dramatic as the technological one. Early humans were no longer passive participants in the natural world. reacting to threats and opportunities as they arose. They had become active predators, capable of planning attacks, coordinating group activities, and systematically exploiting animal populations. This shift from prey to predator fundamentally altered the trajectory of human evolution. The success of these early hunting weapons created new challenges and opportunities. Larger, more reliable food sources supported bigger group sizes and more complex social structures. The need to coordinate hunting activities led to developments in communication and leadership. The ability to process and preserve meat enabled early humans to survive in previously uninhabitable environments and to weather seasonal food shortages that would have devastated earlier populations. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of increasingly sophisticated social behaviors. Tool caches suggest that groups were planning for future needs and storing equipment at strategic locations. Differences in tool quality and materials indicate the emergence of specialized craftsmen whose primary role was weapons production. Evidence of long-distance trade in raw materials points to complex intergroup relationships and the beginnings of economic specialization. The landscape of Africa was changing as well. The success of human hunting was beginning to impact animal populations in measurable ways. Large mammal species that had thrived for millions of years were showing signs of population stress. Migration patterns were shifting as herds learned to avoid areas of heavy human activity. The first hints of what would eventually become humanity's global impact on wildlife populations were beginning to appear in the fossil record. But early humans weren't content to remain in Africa. Armed with their increasingly sophisticated weapons and hunting strategies, they began to venture beyond the continent that had given birth to their species. The first evidence of human habitation outside Africa appears around 1.8 million years ago in sites like Dmanisi in Georgia, where archaeologists have found early human fossils associated with Oldowan tools and evidence of systematic hunting. These early migrations represent one of the most significant events in the history of life on Earth. For the first time, a species was deliberately expanding its range, not through passive dispersal, but through active colonization enabled by technology. The weapons that had given early humans dominance over African megafauna were about to encounter entirely new environments, prey species, and challenges that would further accelerate the evolution of hunting technology. The journey from simple stone choppers to sophisticated composite weapons had taken over 2 million years, but it was just the beginning. The early humans spreading across Asia and eventually Europe carried with them not just physical tools, but the cognitive abilities and cultural traditions that would enable them to adapt their hunting technologies to any environment they encountered. The age of human expansion was about to begin, and at its heart were the weapons that had transformed a vulnerable primate into the most dangerous predator the planet had ever seen. The spear in your hand trembles as you crouch behind a fallen log, watching a massive, straight-tusked elephant browse just 30 yards away. This isn't the African elephant you might recognize from nature documentaries. This beast stands 14 feet at the shoulder, its tusks stretching 12 feet in front of it like curved ivory spears. Its hide is thick as armor plating, scarred from battles with saber-toothed cats and territorial disputes with its own kind. And you, barely 5 feet tall, with a brain half the size of a modern human's, are planning to kill it. This is the reality that early humans faced as they spread across Europe and Asia between 1.5 and 800,000 years ago. The weapons that had served them well in Africa were about to be tested against entirely new challenges. Different climates, unfamiliar prey species, and environments that ranged from frozen tundra to dense temperate forests. Each new habitat demanded innovations in hunting technology that would push human intelligence and creativity to unprecedented levels. The archaeological site at Schöningen in Germany preserves one of the most remarkable snapshots of early human hunting prowess. Here, archaeologists discovered wooden spears dating back 400,000 years, still perfectly preserved in ancient lakeside sediments. These weren't crude pointed sticks, they were sophisticated engineered weapons, carefully shaped from spruce wood, with their centers of gravity positioned for optimal throwing performance. Modern ballistic tests show these spears could penetrate elephant hide at distances of up to 20 meters. But the spears themselves are only part of the story. The context in which they were found reveals the complexity of early human hunting strategies. The Schöningen site preserves evidence of a coordinated attack on a herd of wild horses. Stone tools scattered around butchered remains show systematic processing. Fire-cracked rocks indicate cooking areas. The spatial distribution of artifacts tells a story of planned ambush, successful kill, and organized feast that involved dozens of individuals working together. The horses themselves weren't easy prey. These weren't the domesticated animals we know today, but powerful, aggressive creatures standing over 6 feet at the shoulder. Their hooves could crush skulls, their teeth could tear flesh, and they moved in protective herds with complex social hierarchies and sentinel systems. Hunting them required not just better weapons, but entirely new tactical approaches. Early humans were learning to read animal behavior with the precision of modern wildlife biologists. They studied migration patterns, identified watering holes and feeding areas, and developed strategies for separating individuals from protective herds. Evidence from multiple sites shows that they were using fire as a hunting tool, creating controlled burns to drive animals toward waiting hunters, or to funnel prey through narrow passages where spear-wielding groups could maximize their effectiveness. The cognitive demands of these hunting strategies were staggering. Success required spatial reasoning to predict animal movements, temporal planning to coordinate group activities, and social intelligence to maintain cooperation among dozens of individuals with potentially competing interests. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful hunting groups developed primitive forms of leadership, with certain individuals taking responsibility for planning and coordinating attacks. Tool technology was evolving rapidly during this period, driven by the demands of hunting increasingly dangerous prey in unfamiliar environments. The simple hand axes that had dominated earlier periods were being supplemented by specialized implements designed for specific tasks. Scrapers for processing hides became more refined, with carefully retouched edges that could remove flesh without damaging valuable leather. Cutting tools developed longer, sharper edges for efficient butchery. Piercing implements became more robust to handle the stress of penetrating thick hides and dense bones. The development of hafting technology, the process of attaching stone points to wooden handles, represented a quantum leap in weapon effectiveness. A stone blade held in the hand was limited by human grip strength and the length of the arm. The same blade mounted on a wooden handle could deliver exponentially more force and reach targets that were previously inaccessible. This seemingly simple innovation required understanding of leverage, material properties, and binding techniques that pushed early human engineering skills to new levels. Archaeological experiments have shown that creating effective hafted tools required extensive trial and error. The binding materials had to be strong enough to hold under stress, but flexible enough to absorb impact. The attachment methods had to distribute force evenly to prevent the stone point from splitting the wooden handle. The proportions of handle length to blade size had to be optimized for the intended use. Each successful design represented hundreds of hours of experimentation and refinement. The social implications of these technological advances were profound. Groups with better weapons could access higher quality food sources, supporting larger populations and more complex social structures. The knowledge required to manufacture sophisticated tools became a form of cultural capital that could be traded, taught, and inherited. Archaeological evidence suggests that master toolmakers held special status within early human groups. their skills making the difference between survival and extinction. Regional variations in tool traditions began to emerge as different groups adapted to local conditions. The Acheulean hand axe tradition that had dominated much of Africa and southern Europe gave way to more diverse technologies in northern regions. The Clactonian tradition in Britain emphasized heavy choppers and scrapers suited for processing large game in forested environments. The Tyetsean tradition in France developed smaller, more portable tools adapted for mobile hunting groups following seasonal migrations. These regional differences weren't just stylistic preferences, but functional adaptations to specific environmental challenges. Hunting mammoth on the open steppes of Central Europe required different weapons than pursuing deer through the dense forests of Britain. Fishing for salmon in northern rivers demanded tools unlike those needed for scavenging along Mediterranean coastlines. Each environment was shaping human technology in ways that would eventually lead to the incredible diversity of hunting weapons found in later periods. The psychological impact of successful big game hunting was transforming early human societies in fundamental ways. Groups that could reliably kill large animals developed different relationships with their environment, different concepts of territory and ownership, and different approaches to risk and planning. The feast or famine cycle that had characterized earlier human existence was being replaced by more predictable food procurement strategies. Evidence from multiple sites shows that successful hunting groups were beginning to establish semi-permanent base camps, locations that were occupied repeatedly over long periods. These weren't yet permanent settlements, but they represented a significant shift from the constant mobility that had characterized earlier human populations. The ability to predict where and when animals could be hunted was enabling early humans to invest in infrastructure, to cache tools and supplies, and to develop more complex social relationships. The weapons themselves were becoming objects of cultural significance beyond their practical utility. Archaeological evidence suggests that certain tools were kept and maintained long after their functional usefulness had ended, possibly serving as symbols of successful hunts or markers of individual status. The craftsmanship invested in some implements far exceeded practical requirements, indicating that aesthetic considerations were beginning to influence tool production. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of teaching traditions specifically focused on weapons technology. Archaeological sites show clear evidence of learning areas where novice toolmakers practiced their skills under the guidance of experienced craftsmen. Failed attempts, partially completed projects, and gradually improving examples of tool production tell stories of knowledge transmission that span multiple generations. These teaching traditions were crucial for human survival in increasingly challenging environments. The knowledge required to create effective hunting weapons was becoming too complex to rediscover independently. Groups that failed to maintain their technological traditions faced extinction, while those that successfully passed their skills to the next generation thrived and expanded. The weapons revolution of this period was setting the stage for even more dramatic developments to come. The basic principles of projectile design, the understanding of leverage and mechanical advantage, and the social structures necessary for coordinated hunting were all being established. Early humans were transforming from opportunistic scavengers into apex predators, and their weapons were the key to this transformation. As the climate began to shift toward the ice ages that would dominate the next phase of human evolution, these early hunting technologies would face their ultimate test. The megafauna that roamed the increasingly frozen landscapes of Europe and Asia were larger, more dangerous, and better adapted to harsh conditions than anything early humans had encountered before. The weapons that would emerge from this crucible would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The frozen wastelands of Ice Age Europe stretched endlessly in every direction, a landscape so harsh it would kill an unprepared modern human within hours. Yet here, between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago, early humans not only survived but flourished, developing hunting weapons so advanced they wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. This was the crucible that forged humanity's most lethal innovations, where the difference between a perfectly balanced spear and a clumsy stick meant the difference between feast and famine, between life and death. Picture yourself standing on the edge of what would one day become the English Channel, except there's no water in sight. The sea level has dropped over 400 feet, exposing a vast plain that connects Britain to continental Europe. Massive glaciers, some over a mile thick, have locked up so much of the world's water that entire continental shelves lie bare and frozen. The landscape before you is tundra as far as the eye can see, broken only by scattered groves of hardy birch and pine trees that somehow manage to survive the brutal cold. But this frozen wasteland isn't empty. It's teeming with some of the most magnificent and dangerous animals that ever walked the earth. Woolly mammoths, standing 12 feet tall and weighing 8 tons, move across the landscape in small family groups, their curved tusks cutting through snowdrifts as they search for buried vegetation. Cave bears, twice the size of modern grizzlies, emerge from their winter dens ready to defend territories with bone-crushing jaws and claws like daggers. The predators of this Ice Age world make today's apex hunters look tame by comparison. Cave lions, larger than modern African lions, prowl the steppes in coordinated prides. Short-faced bears, standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder when on all fours, can run down prey at speeds that would shame a racehorse. Saber-toothed cats with canine teeth 7 inches long specialize in ambush attacks that can drop a bison with a single bite to the throat. And moving through this frozen hell with increasing confidence are early humans, no longer the scavenging opportunists of earlier eras, but skilled hunters whose weapons technology has advanced to levels that seem almost miraculous given their limited resources. These aren't modern humans yet, but Neanderthals and late Homo erectus populations whose brains have grown larger and whose tool-making abilities have reached new peaks of sophistication. The archaeological record from this period reads like a catalogue of human ingenuity pushed to its absolute limits. At sites across Europe, researchers have found evidence of hunting strategies so complex and weapons so refined that they challenge every assumption about early human intelligence. These weren't primitive cave dwellers stumbling through the Ice Age, but skilled engineers whose survival depended on their ability to outthink, outplan, and ultimately outkill some of the most formidable animals in Earth's history. The spear technology alone represents a quantum leap in human innovation. Gone are the simple pointed sticks of earlier periods, replaced by composite weapons that required master craftsmen to produce. The wooden shafts were carefully selected from specific tree species, aged and seasoned to achieve optimal flexibility and strength. The proportions were calculated with mathematical precision, the balance point positioned to maximize throwing accuracy and penetrating power. But it was the stone points that truly revolutionized Ice Age hunting. These weren't the crude choppers of earlier traditions, but exquisitely crafted implements that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with stone tool technology. The Levallois technique, perfected during this period, allowed toolmakers to predetermine the exact size and shape of flakes before striking them from prepared cores. This level of precision required spatial reasoning abilities that approached modern human cognition. The production of a single high-quality spear point could take hours of concentrated work by a master craftsman. Every strike had to be calculated, every angle considered, every flaw in the raw material anticipated and worked around. Archaeological experiments show that creating these tools required not just technical skill, but artistic vision. The ability to see the finished product hidden within the raw stone, and to bring it into existence through hundreds of precise actions. The hafting technology that attached these points to wooden shafts represented another breakthrough in materials engineering. Early humans had learned to use heated tree resins as adhesives, creating bonds strong enough to hold under the enormous stresses of impact with thick hides and dense bones. They wrapped the attachment points with sinew or plant fibers, distributing stress loads and preventing catastrophic failures that could leave a hunter weaponless in the face of a charging mammoth. Evidence from kill sites across Europe shows these weapons in action against prey that defies imagination. At Leringen in Germany, archaeologists found a wooden spear still embedded between the ribs of a straight-tusked elephant, the weapon having penetrated over 2 feet into the massive animal's chest cavity. The precision of the strike suggests not random luck, but practiced skill, the result of generations of accumulated knowledge about elephant anatomy and vulnerability points. The hunting strategies revealed by these sites required levels of coordination and planning that approach modern military operations. At Torralba in Spain, evidence suggests that early humans used controlled fires to drive entire herds of elephants and rhinoceros into boggy areas where the massive animals became trapped and vulnerable to spear attacks. The logistics of such operations, coordinating dozens of hunters across miles of terrain while managing fire in specific weather conditions, demanded leadership structures and communication systems of remarkable sophistication. But perhaps the most impressive evidence comes from the high alpine sites of the European mountains, where early humans were hunting cave bears in their own dens during the depths of winter. These weren't desperate acts of starvation, but planned expeditions targeting animals when their fat reserves were at their peak, and their meat would provide maximum nutritional return. The weapons found at these sites show adaptations specifically designed for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. Shorter spears with reinforced points capable of multiple strikes. The psychological transformation represented by these hunting achievements cannot be overstated. Early humans had moved beyond simply reacting to their environment to actively reshaping it according to their needs. They were no longer afraid of the Ice Age megafauna, but saw them as resources to be harvested through superior intelligence and technology. The predators that had once hunted early humans were now avoiding areas of heavy human activity, the balance of power having shifted decisively in favor of the tool makers. Regional specialization in weapon technology was becoming increasingly sophisticated as different groups adapted to local conditions and prey species. The Mousterian tradition, associated with Neanderthals, developed a toolkit specifically optimized for hunting large game in forested environments. Their spears were shorter and more robust than those used by groups hunting on open steppes, designed for close-range encounters where accuracy mattered more than maximum range. In contrast, the groups following mammoth herds across the open tundra developed longer, lighter spears, optimized for throwing at greater distances. These weapons incorporated flexible wooden shafts that could absorb the shock of impact without breaking, allowing them to be recovered and reused multiple times. The stone points were designed with specific angles and proportions that maximize penetration while minimizing the chance of the weapon becoming stuck in bone or cartilage. The social implications of these technological advances were reshaping early human societies in fundamental ways. Master weapon makers were developing into a specialized class whose skills were essential for group survival. Archaeological evidence suggests these craftsmen were provided with the best food, given protection during conflicts, and their knowledge was carefully guarded and transmitted only to selected apprentices. The weapons themselves were becoming objects of cultural significance that transcended their practical utility. Certain spears show evidence of decoration and special care that goes far beyond functional requirements. These implements may have served as symbols of successful hunts, markers of individual prowess, or ritual objects connected to early human spiritual beliefs about the relationship between hunters and their prey. Evidence from burial sites during this period shows that weapons were sometimes interred with their owners, suggesting that the bond between hunter and tool had taken on spiritual dimensions. The careful placement of spears alongside human remains indicates that these implements were seen not just as equipment, but as extensions of the hunter's identity, too important to be left behind even in death. The knowledge systems required to maintain these weapon traditions were becoming increasingly complex and formalized. Archaeological sites show clear evidence of teaching areas where master craftsmen passed their skills to the next generation through structured apprenticeships. The learning process could take years, with novices progressing through carefully designed stages of increasing complexity and responsibility. These educational systems were crucial for cultural continuity in an environment where technical knowledge literally meant the difference between survival and extinction. Groups that failed to maintain their weapon-making traditions faced inevitable decline as their hunting effectiveness diminished and their access to high-quality protein sources decreased. Conversely, groups that successfully preserved and improved their technological knowledge gained decisive advantages that allowed them to expand into new territories and increase their population sizes. The standardization of weapon designs within regional traditions indicates that early humans had developed quality control systems to ensure that tools met minimum performance standards. Archaeological evidence shows that defective weapons were often reworked or discarded rather than used, suggesting that hunters understood the critical importance of reliable equipment when facing dangerous prey. The raw materials used in weapon production were themselves becoming subjects of specialized knowledge and long-distance trade. High-quality stone suitable for tool making was often available only at specific geological locations, sometimes hundreds of miles from where the finished tools were used. The movement of these materials across vast distances required organized expeditions, established trade relationships, and the development of early economic systems based on the exchange of specialized goods. Different types of stone were valued for specific applications, with toolmakers developing encyclopedic knowledge of material properties and optimal uses. Obsidian from volcanic regions could be knapped to create edges sharper than modern surgical steel, making it ideal for cutting and skinning tools. Flint and chert provided durability and reliability for heavy-duty applications, like spear points and choppers. Quartzite offered impact resistance for tools that would be subjected to repeated stress. The transportation and storage of these valuable raw materials required sophisticated logistical planning. Archaeological sites show evidence of material caches where groups stockpiled high-quality stone at strategic locations, ensuring access to essential resources during seasonal migrations or emergency situations. The security of these caches may have been one of the earliest forms of property ownership, with specific groups claiming exclusive rights to particular locations and resources. As Ice Age conditions intensified and animal populations became more concentrated around shrinking refugia, competition between different human groups for access to prime hunting territories was becoming increasingly fierce. The weapons that had been developed for hunting were being adapted for warfare, with new designs optimized for human versus human combat rather than predator-prey encounters. Archaeological evidence from this period shows the first clear signs of systematic violence between human groups, with skeletal remains bearing weapon wounds and defensive injuries that could only result from organized conflict. The same technological innovations that had made early humans such effective hunters were now being turned against other humans in struggles over resources and territory. The stage was being set for the final phase of Ice Age weapon development, a period of rapid innovation and cultural explosion that would produce the most sophisticated hunting technologies the prehistoric world had ever seen. The foundations had been laid through millions of years of gradual development, but the greatest achievements were still to come, as modern humans entered the scene with cognitive abilities that would revolutionize not just weapons technology, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The Ice Age was far from over, and the most dangerous prey that early human weapons would ever face was about to make its appearance on the frozen landscapes of Europe and Asia. The ultimate test of human hunting prowess was approaching, and the weapons that emerged from this final crucible would be unlike anything the world had ever seen. The transformation began around 50,000 years ago, when a new type of human walked onto the frozen stage of Ice Age Europe. These weren't the robust Neanderthals who had dominated the landscape for hundreds of thousands of years. nor the earlier Homo erectus populations that had first ventured beyond Africa. These were anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, carrying with them cognitive abilities and cultural innovations that would revolutionize hunting forever. At first glance, these newcomers seemed almost fragile compared to their predecessors. They were lighter in build, with smaller muscles and less robust bone structure than the Neanderthals, who had adapted so perfectly to Ice Age conditions. But what they lacked in physical power, they more than compensated for with unprecedented levels of creativity, abstract thinking, and technological innovation. The archaeological record from this period explodes with evidence of a cognitive revolution that would transform simple hunting tools into precision instruments of death. The most dramatic innovation was the development of projectile weapons that could kill at distances previously unimaginable. The atlatl, or spear thrower, multiplied human throwing power by factors of 3 or 4, extending effective hunting range to over 100 meters while delivering impact forces capable of penetrating the thickest mammoth hide. This wasn't just an incremental improvement over earlier weapons, but a fundamental reimagining of what hunting could be. Archaeological experiments with reconstructed atlatls demonstrate their devastating effectiveness. A skilled user could launch a spear with enough force to punch through a car door, while maintaining accuracy that would allow precise targeting of vital organs from distances where prey animals felt completely safe. The psychological impact on both hunters and hunted was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, large dangerous animals could be killed without the hunters ever coming within range of horn, claw, or crushing hooves. The design principles behind these weapons reveal cognitive abilities that approach modern engineering sophistication. The atlatl itself was carved from carefully selected wood with precise curves and proportions that maximized leverage while minimizing weight. The finger loops and grip surfaces were positioned with mathematical accuracy to optimize energy transfer from human arm to projectile. Even the decoration found on many examples served functional purposes, with carved ridges and textures improving grip under wet or cold conditions. But the real innovation was in the projectiles themselves. The spears designed for atlatl use were unlike anything that had come before. They were lighter and more flexible than hand-thrown spears, designed to flex during launch and then stabilize in flight for maximum accuracy. The stone points were smaller but more precisely shaped, with carefully calculated proportions that balanced penetration power against the risk of breaking on impact. Evidence from kill sites across Europe shows these weapons in action against prey that would have been impossible to hunt with earlier technologies. At Solutré in France, archaeologists discovered the remains of over 100,000 horses killed over a period of several thousand years. The bones showing consistent patterns of projectile wounds that could only have been inflicted by atlatl-launched spears. The precision and efficiency of these kills suggests hunting strategies of remarkable sophistication. The development of specialized hunting blinds and drive lines allowed early humans to channel animal movements while remaining hidden from their prey. Stone walls and wooden fences directed herds toward killing zones where hidden hunters could launch coordinated attacks with devastating effectiveness. These installations required engineering knowledge, construction skills, and strategic thinking that approached the level of military fortifications. Regional variations in projectile technology were emerging as different groups adapted their weapons to local prey and environmental conditions. The Solutrean tradition of southwestern Europe developed leaf-shaped points of extraordinary thinness and symmetry, masterpieces of stone knapping that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available materials. Some of these points were so thin and delicate that they seem almost too beautiful to use, leading some researchers to suggest they served ceremonial as well as practical functions. In contrast, the groups following reindeer herds across the northern tundra developed robust, triangular points designed for reliability rather than elegance. These weapons were built to be repaired in the field, with modular designs that allowed damaged components to be quickly replaced, without specialized tools or extensive crafting time. The pragmatic functionality of these weapons reflects the harsh realities of life in environments where equipment failure could mean death. The social organization required to maintain these sophisticated weapon systems was becoming increasingly complex. Master craftsmen were developing into a specialized class whose skills were essential for group survival, but required years of training to develop. Archaeological evidence suggests that the most skilled toolmakers were exempt from other forms of labor, supported by the community, while they focused exclusively on weapons production. The knowledge required to create these advanced projectile systems was becoming too complex for any individual to master completely. Specialization was emerging within the crafting community, with different individuals focusing on specific aspects of weapon production. Some specialized in stone point creation, others in shaft preparation, still others in the complex binding and balancing required to assemble finished weapons. This division of labor required unprecedented levels of cooperation and trust within early human groups. A hunter's life depended on the skill of multiple craftsmen, each of whom had to perform their specialized tasks with perfect precision. The social bonds necessary to maintain these relationships were creating new forms of human community based on interdependence and shared expertise rather than simple kinship ties. Evidence from burial sites during this period shows that weapons were taking on symbolic significance that transcended their practical utility. Elaborate spear points, too delicate for actual use, were being created specifically for ceremonial purposes. These objects may have served as displays of craftsmanship, symbols of group identity, or ritual implements connected to early human spiritual beliefs about hunting and death. The standardization of weapon designs within cultural traditions indicates that early humans had developed sophisticated quality control systems. Archaeological analysis shows that projectile points within specific traditions conform to remarkably consistent proportions and specifications, suggesting the existence of formal standards that all craftsmen were expected to meet. Weapons that failed to meet these standards were often reworked or discarded rather than used. The raw materials used in advanced weapon production were becoming subjects of increasingly specialized knowledge and long-distance trade networks. Obsidian from volcanic regions could be knapped to create edges sharper than modern surgical instruments, but it was brittle and required careful handling. High-grade flint provided durability and reliability, but was available only from specific geological formations. The movement of these materials across hundreds of miles required organized trade relationships and sophisticated logistical planning. Different groups were developing distinctive styles and techniques that served as cultural markers, ways of identifying group membership and maintaining social boundaries. A skilled observer could determine the origin of a projectile point based on subtle differences in knapping technique, proportions, and finishing details. These stylistic variations were becoming badges of identity in an increasingly complex social landscape. The effectiveness of these advanced projectile weapons was beginning to have measurable impacts on animal populations across Europe and Asia. Archaeological evidence suggests that several species of large mammals were experiencing population pressures that may have been related to human hunting activities. The efficiency of atlatl-based hunting was allowing human populations to grow while simultaneously depleting the prey species they depended upon. This success was creating new challenges for early human societies. Groups that had perfected their hunting techniques were finding themselves victims of their own effectiveness. As local animal populations declined and traditional hunting territories became less productive, the need to find new prey sources was driving human expansion into previously unexplored territories and forcing adaptations to unfamiliar environments and prey species. The competition for remaining high-quality hunting grounds was intensifying conflicts between different human groups. The same weapons that had made these populations such effective hunters were being adapted for warfare, with new designs optimized for human versus human combat rather than predator-prey encounters. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing signs of systematic violence, with fortified settlements and mass burial sites that tell stories of organized warfare. But the greatest innovation was yet to come. Around 20,000 years ago, as the Ice Age reached its maximum intensity and traditional prey species became increasingly scarce, early humans developed what may have been the most revolutionary hunting weapon in prehistory. The bow and arrow represented not just an improvement in existing projectile technology, but a completely new approach to the problem of killing at a distance. The cognitive leap required to invent the bow was enormous. Unlike the atlatl, which was essentially a mechanical extension of the human arm, the bow stored and released energy in a completely different way. The archer had to understand concepts of stored potential energy, release timing, and projectile ballistics that required abstract thinking abilities of the highest order. The fact that bows appeared simultaneously in widely separated regions suggests that this invention represented a fundamental breakthrough in human cognitive evolution. The earliest bows were simple, but effective designs carved from carefully selected wood and strung with sinew or plant fiber. Archaeological evidence from sites like Stellmore in Germany shows that these weapons were being used to hunt everything from small birds to large mammals with devastating effectiveness. The arrows were even more sophisticated than the bows themselves, with precisely balanced shafts, carefully shaped points, and fletching made from bird feathers that provided aerodynamic stability. The accuracy achievable with these early bows was remarkable by any standard. Skilled archers could consistently hit targets the size of a dinner plate at ranges of 50 meters or more, while maintaining the power necessary to penetrate thick hides and dense bones. This combination of accuracy and lethality made the bow and arrow the most effective hunting weapon that had ever been developed. The social implications of bow technology were profound. Unlike the atlatl, which required considerable physical strength and years of practice to master, the bow could be used effectively by individuals who were smaller, younger, or less physically powerful. This democratization of hunting ability was beginning to blur traditional distinctions between hunters and non-hunters, creating new social roles and opportunities within early human communities. Women and adolescents could now participate in hunting activities that had previously been restricted to adult males with exceptional physical abilities. Archaeological evidence suggests that bow hunting was practiced by a much broader segment of the population than earlier weapon technologies, leading to changes in social organization and gender roles that would have far-reaching consequences for human cultural development. The psychological impact of mastering bow technology was transforming early human relationships with their environment in fundamental ways. The ability to kill silently at long range was creating new concepts of territory, ownership, and control that went far beyond anything seen in earlier periods. Hunters armed with bows could defend resources, eliminate competitors, and exercise dominion over landscapes in ways that their ancestors could never have imagined. As the Ice Age began its slow retreat around 15,000 years ago, the weapons that had emerged from this frozen crucible were poised to reshape the entire trajectory of human civilization. The hunting technologies developed during hundreds of thousands of years of struggle against Ice Age megafauna would soon be turned toward new purposes, as humans began the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture and permanent settlement. The bow and arrow, the atlatl, the sophisticated composite spears, and all the knowledge systems required to create and maintain them represented humanity's first great technological revolution. These weren't just hunting tools, but the foundations upon which all subsequent human achievements would be built. The cognitive abilities, social structures, and cultural traditions forged in the desperate struggle for survival during the Ice Age had created the platform for everything that would follow. Standing on the threshold between the prehistoric and historic worlds, early humans possessed weapons technology that wouldn't be significantly improved upon for thousands of years. They had transformed themselves from vulnerable primates into the most dangerous predators the planet had ever seen, and they were about to turn their attention from hunting animals to reshaping the world itself. the age of human dominance was about to begin, and at its foundation were the weapons that 4.7 million years of evolution had perfected through trial, error, and the relentless pressure of survival in a world that showed no mercy to the weak or unprepared. The mammoth fell with a thunderous crash that shook the frozen ground beneath your feet, its massive tusks carving deep furrows in the snow as 12 tons of prehistoric giant collapsed in defeat. Your arrows had found their mark with precision that would have seemed impossible just generations before. 3 shafts, each placed with surgical accuracy between the ribs, had brought down an animal that your great-great-grandfather would have fled from in terror. But you're not celebrating yet. The real work is just beginning. This kill represents something far more significant than a successful hunt. It's the culmination of humanity's longest research and development project, a 4.7 million year journey from picking up the first crude stone to crafting weapons so sophisticated they rival modern engineering achievements. Your bow, your arrows, even the bronze knife at your belt, all represent the accumulated wisdom of countless generations who lived, struggled, and died to perfect the art of making tools that kill. We're now entering the final phase of our journey through deep time, a period when human weapons technology exploded into innovations so advanced they would dominate battlefields for millennia to come. The Ice Age was ending, but the weapons it had forged were about to reshape human civilization in ways that would echo through history to the present day. The retreat of the glaciers around 12,000 years ago didn't just change the climate, it fundamentally altered the entire context of human existence. The vast herds of megafauna that had sustained Ice Age hunters were disappearing, not just migrating, but going extinct at rates that suggest human hunting had become too efficient for its own good. The mammoths, giant bison, cave bears, and saber-toothed cats that had dominated the landscape for millions of years were vanishing, leaving behind a world that seemed almost empty by comparison. Archaeological sites from this period tell a sobering story of human success turned catastrophic. The Clovis culture of North America, armed with sophisticated fluted spear points and atlatls, spread across the continent in just a few centuries, leaving behind kill sites that document the systematic elimination of entire species. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, short-faced bears, American cheetahs, all disappeared within a geological instant of human arrival. The same pattern repeated across the globe as human hunters, armed with Ice Age weapons technology, encountered naive fauna that had never faced such efficient predators. In Australia, giant kangaroos, massive wombats, and predatory lizards the size of crocodiles vanished shortly after human arrival. Madagascar lost its elephant birds and giant lemurs within centuries of human colonization. Even isolated islands weren't safe, as seafaring humans brought their weapons technology to every corner of the globe. But this ecological catastrophe forced another evolutionary leap in human technology. With the traditional large game disappearing, hunters had to adapt their weapons for entirely different types of prey. The massive spear points designed for mammoth hunting were replaced by smaller, more precise implements optimized for deer, rabbits, and birds. The archaeological record shows an explosion of specialized weapon types as different groups adapted to rapidly changing environments. The development of microliths, tiny stone blades that could be hafted together to create composite cutting edges, represented a revolution in efficiency and versatility. These miniature implements allowed hunters to create arrows, spears, and knives using a fraction of the raw materials required by earlier technologies. A single high-quality stone core could now provide enough cutting edges to outfit an entire hunting party. The social implications were staggering. Groups that had specialized in mammoth hunting found their expertise suddenly obsolete, while communities that had focused on smaller game gained decisive advantages in the post-glacial world. The knowledge systems that had sustained human societies for millennia were being overturned within a few generations. forcing rapid cultural adaptations that tested human flexibility to its limits. This period of technological upheaval coincided with the emergence of the world's first permanent settlements. Groups that had followed migrating herds for tens of thousands of years were beginning to establish fixed bases, initially as seasonal camps, but eventually as year-round villages. These settlements required entirely new approaches to resource management, territory defense, and social organization. The weapons developed for hunting were being rapidly adapted for a new purpose that would dominate human history for the next 10,000 years. Warfare between human groups was becoming systematized, with specialized combat weapons that bore little resemblance to their hunting ancestors. The same cognitive abilities that had enabled humans to develop complex hunting strategies were now being applied to the problem of killing other humans more efficiently. Archaeological evidence from early settlements shows clear signs of fortification and organized violence. Walls, ditches, and watchtowers appear in the archaeological record, alongside mass graves that tell stories of systematic warfare. The transition from hunting to farming wasn't the peaceful development often portrayed in popular accounts, but a violent struggle for control of the world's most productive agricultural lands. The agricultural revolution itself was intimately connected to weapons technology in ways that historians are only beginning to understand. The tools used to clear forests, till soil, and harvest crops were often identical to those used in warfare. The bronze axes that felled trees to create farmland were the same implements that split skulls on ancient battlefields. The knowledge required to forge agricultural tools was inseparable from the metallurgical expertise needed to create superior weapons. Bronze itself represented the culmination of human materials, science achievements that had been developing since the first stone tools. The ability to extract metals from ore, create alloys with specific properties, and shape molten metal into complex forms required understanding of chemistry, physics, and engineering that pushed human intelligence to new levels. Bronze weapons weren't just superior to stone implements, they were fundamentally different categories of technology. The social structures required to support bronze production were transforming human societies in profound ways. The specialized knowledge needed to locate ore deposits, construct furnaces, and master smelting techniques was creating new classes of technical experts whose skills were essential but closely guarded. The control of metal resources was becoming a source of political power that would dominate human civilization for millennia. Trade networks were expanding to continental scales as groups sought access to the tin and copper needed for bronze production. The amber routes that connected the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the jade roads that linked China to Central Asia, and the obsidian trails that crisscrossed the Americas were all driven by the demand for materials needed to create superior weapons and tools. The standardization of weapon designs was reaching levels that approached mass production. Archaeological analysis shows that bronze weapons within specific cultural traditions conform to remarkably consistent specifications, suggesting the existence of formal training systems and quality control procedures. Master smiths were developing into hereditary castes, whose knowledge was passed down through carefully controlled apprenticeships. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of professional warrior classes, whose entire social identity was built around weapons expertise. These weren't part-time hunters who occasionally engaged in violence, but full-time specialists whose lives revolved around perfecting the art of combat. The archaeological record shows increasingly elaborate burial practices for these warriors, with grave goods that include multiple weapons, armor, and symbols of martial prowess. The psychological transformation represented by this shift cannot be overstated. Human societies were moving beyond the practical violence of hunting and territorial defense to embrace warfare as a cultural institution with its own values, rituals, and social structures. The weapons that had emerged from the desperate struggle for survival during the Ice Age were becoming symbols of honor, power, and social status. Regional weapon traditions were diverging rapidly, as different cultures adapted their military technologies to local conditions and combat doctrines. The leaf-shaped bronze swords of Atlantic Europe emphasized cutting power and elegant design. The narrow, thrusting weapons of the Mediterranean prioritized penetration and precision. The massive two-handed axes of Northern Europe maximized impact force for breaking through armor and shields. These weren't just stylistic preferences, but reflections of fundamentally different approaches to combat that would influence military development for thousands of years. The tactical doctrines associated with different weapon systems were creating distinct martial cultures with their own training methods, social structures, and strategic philosophies. The development of composite weapons was reaching new levels of sophistication as smiths learned to combine different materials for optimal performance. Bronze points hafted to wooden shafts and bound with sinew created spears that were lighter, more flexible, and more durable than pure metal weapons. The knowledge required to design and construct these composite systems was becoming increasingly specialized and technically demanding. Evidence from weapons caches and battlefield sites shows that early Bronze Age warriors were carrying multiple specialized weapons optimized for different combat situations. Swords for close combat, spears for formation fighting, axes for breaking shields, and bows for ranged engagement. The logistics of equipping and maintaining these diverse weapon systems was creating new forms of military organization required to master these weapon and supply chains. The training systems was becoming formalized into systematic martial arts traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that warrior societies were developing structured training programs that could take decades to complete. The physical conditioning, technical skills, and tactical knowledge required to be an effective Bronze Age warrior represented a level of specialization that approached modern military professionalism. Ceremonial weapons were emerging as distinct categories of objects that served symbolic rather than practical functions. These implements, often too delicate or valuable for actual combat, were being created to display wealth, craftsmanship, and social status. The artistic achievement represented by some of these ceremonial weapons rivals the finest decorative arts of any period in human history. The metallurgical knowledge required to create these ceremonial pieces was pushing the boundaries of what was possible with Bronze Age technology. Smiths were learning to create alloys with specific colors, to inlay different metals in complex patterns, and to forge objects with proportions and decorations that required mathematical precision and artistic vision of the highest order. Religious and spiritual dimensions were becoming increasingly important aspects of weapons culture. Archaeological evidence suggests that many societies were developing elaborate rituals around weapon creation, blessing, and retirement. Some weapons were apparently considered to possess spiritual power, or to be inhabited by supernatural forces that could influence the outcome of combat. The transition from stone to metal weapons was more than just a technological upgrade. It represented a fundamental shift in human relationships with the material world. The ability to transform raw earth into tools through fire and skill was seen as a form of magic that connected smiths to divine powers. The social status of metalworkers reflected this perceived connection to supernatural forces. As Bronze Age civilizations reached their peak around 3,000 years ago, the weapons they produced represented the culmination of humanity's longest and most successful research program. From the first crude choppers of 4.7 million years ago to the sophisticated swords and spears of the late Bronze Age, human weapons technology had achieved a level of refinement that wouldn't be significantly improved upon until the development of gunpowder weapons thousands of years later. The cognitive abilities, social structures, and cultural traditions that had been forged through millions of years of weapons development were now being applied to challenges far beyond simple survival. The same minds that had learned to knap flint were now designing irrigation systems. The hands that had crafted spear points were building monuments that still inspire awe today. The social cooperation that had enabled coordinated mammoth hunts was creating the first true civilizations. Standing at the end of this incredible journey through deep time, we can see that the story of human weapons development is really the story of human intelligence itself. Every innovation, from the first intentionally modified stone to the most sophisticated bronze sword, represented a cognitive breakthrough that expanded human capabilities and reshaped our relationship with the world around us. The weapons in your kitchen drawer, the tools in your garage, even the smartphone in your pocket, all trace their lineage back to those first desperate experiments with shaped stone on the African savanna 4.7 million years ago. The same problem-solving abilities, the same drive for innovation, the same refusal to accept limitations that enabled our ancestors to transform from vulnerable primates into apex predators continue to drive human achievement today. We are the descendants of the greatest weapons developers in Earth's history, inheritors of a technological tradition that spans millions of years and countless generations of innovation. Every time we pick up a tool, we're continuing a conversation with our ancestors that began when the first early human realized that a shaped stone could extend the power of the human hand. The age of stone and bronze weapons may be over, but the cognitive revolution that created them continues. The same minds that learned to hunt mammoths are now reaching for the stars. And the journey that began with a simple stone tool may ultimately take us to worlds our ancestors could never have imagined. The bronze sword gleaming in your hand represents more than just advanced metallurgy. It's the physical manifestation of humanity's greatest evolutionary leap. The moment when our species learned to externalize intelligence into objects that could think, remember, and act on our behalf. But as impressive as bronze weapons were, they were merely setting the stage for innovations that would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare and reshape human civilization itself. Around 1200 BCE, something extraordinary happened that would echo through history for the next 3 millennia. The Bronze Age was ending, not through gradual decline but through catastrophic collapse that historians still struggle to fully explain. Entire civilizations vanished almost overnight. Trade networks that had spanned continents simply disappeared. The sophisticated bronze-working technologies that had taken centuries to develop were abandoned or forgotten across vast regions of Europe, Asia, and the Mediterranean. But from this apparent catastrophe emerged the most revolutionary advancement in weapons technology since the development of projectile weapons themselves. Iron metallurgy wasn't just an improvement over bronze, it was a complete reimagining of what metal weapons could be. Where bronze required rare tin and copper that had to be traded across vast distances, iron ore was abundant almost everywhere. Where bronze working required specialized knowledge closely guarded by elite craftsmen, iron technology could be mastered by local smiths working with relatively simple equipment. The democratization of superior weapons technology that iron represented was staggering in its implications. For the first time in human history, any group with access to basic raw materials could produce weapons that were superior to anything available to their enemies. The monopolies on advanced military technology that had sustained Bronze Age civilizations were suddenly worthless, swept away by innovations that could be replicated by anyone with the determination to learn. The early iron weapons were crude by later standards, often inferior to the finest bronze implements in terms of sharpness and durability. But iron had advantages that more than compensated for these shortcomings. It could be reworked when damaged, reshaped when broken, and produced in quantities that Bronze Age smiths could never have imagined. An iron sword that chipped in battle could be hammered straight and sharpened again. A bronze sword that broke was essentially worthless until it could be completely reforged. Archaeological evidence from the early Iron Age shows weapons production on scales that seem almost industrial by prehistoric standards. Entire valleys in regions like Anatolia and the Caucasus were devoted to mining, smelting, and forging operations that produced thousands of weapons annually. The social organization required to support these operations was creating new forms of economic and political structure that would influence human civilization for millennia. The knowledge systems required to master ironworking were fundamentally different from those needed for bronze production, where bronze metallurgy was largely a matter of mixing the right proportions of tin and copper. Ironworking required understanding of carbon content, quenching techniques, and tempering processes that were far more complex and variable. The temperature control needed to produce high-quality steel-pushed furnace technology to new levels of sophistication. Master smiths were developing techniques that wouldn't be fully understood scientifically until the modern era. The process of creating pattern-welded steel, where different types of iron were folded and forge-welded together to create blades with complex internal structures, required intuitive understanding of metallurgy that bordered on the mystical. These craftsmen were working with materials, science principles that modern engineers struggle to replicate, even with advanced equipment and theoretical knowledge. The regional variations in ironworking techniques were creating weapons traditions that reflected not just local resources, but distinct philosophical approaches to combat and craftsmanship. The Celtic smiths of Western Europe developed long slashing swords optimized for mounted combat and individual dueling. The Germanic tribes perfected shorter, more robust weapons designed for close formation fighting. The peoples of the steppes created composite bows, reinforced with iron fittings that could penetrate any armor of the period. Each of these traditions represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, refined through countless battles and passed down through carefully maintained apprenticeship systems. The cultural significance of weapons was reaching new heights as different societies developed elaborate mythologies around their martial technologies. Swords were given names and histories, treated as quasi-living entities with their own personalities and supernatural powers. The Japanese tradition of sword making, which would eventually produce the finest edged weapons in human history, was beginning to emerge during this period. The knowledge systems that would create the legendary katana were being developed through systematic experimentation with steel composition, forging techniques, and heat treatment processes. These early Japanese smiths were treating weapon creation as a spiritual discipline that required not just technical skill, but moral and philosophical development. The social status of master weaponsmiths was reaching unprecedented heights in many cultures. These craftsmen were becoming legendary figures whose names were remembered for generations. Their workshops were treated as sacred spaces, where the transformation of raw earth into instruments of power connected the physical and spiritual worlds. The knowledge they possessed was literally worth more than gold, as entire kingdoms could rise or fall based on the quality of their weapons. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of weapons designed specifically for penetrating armor. As ironworking techniques improved and protective equipment became more sophisticated, an arms race developed between offensive and defensive technologies that would drive military innovation for centuries. The long, narrow swords designed to thrust between armor joints were fundamentally different from the broad cutting weapons of earlier periods. This specialization was creating entirely new categories of warriors who trained for specific types of combat. Heavy infantry equipped with thrusting spears and protective armor fought in tight formations that required years of drill to master. Light skirmishers armed with bows and javelins developed tactics based on mobility and harassment rather than direct confrontation. Cavalry armed with lances learned to coordinate mounted charges that could shatter enemy formations through shock and momentum. The training systems required to master these specialized combat roles were becoming increasingly sophisticated and formalized. Archaeological evidence suggests that some societies were establishing what amounted to military academies, where young warriors spent years learning not just weapon techniques, but tactics, strategy, and the complex social codes that governed warfare among professional fighting classes. The psychological transformation represented by these developments was reshaping human societies in profound ways. Warfare was becoming a professional occupation with its own ethical systems, social structures, and cultural values. The amateur violence of earlier periods was being replaced by systematic approaches to combat that treated killing as a skilled trade, requiring years of training and constant practice. Evidence from burial sites during this period shows that warrior elites were developing elaborate status systems based on weapons ownership and combat prowess. The most prestigious graves contain multiple weapons of extraordinary quality, often including implements that were clearly too valuable for practical use. These ceremonial weapons served as symbols of social rank and military achievement that could be displayed and inherited across generations. The standardization of weapon designs was reaching levels that approached modern industrial production. Archaeological analysis shows that iron weapons within specific cultural traditions conform to remarkably consistent specifications, suggesting the existence of formal quality control systems and standardized training programs for smiths. The knowledge required to maintain these standards was becoming too complex for individual craftsmen to master independently. Trade in finished weapons was emerging as a major economic activity that connected distant regions through networks of specialized merchants. High-quality swords produced in renowned smithing centers were being exported across continents to customers willing to pay premium prices for superior equipment. The reputation of certain regions for weapons production was becoming a form of cultural capital that influenced diplomatic and trade relationships. The development of composite armor was forcing corresponding innovations in weapons design. The layered protection systems that combined leather, metal, and textile components required weapons capable of defeating multiple types of defensive materials. Smiths were learning to create specialized points and edges optimized for penetrating specific types of armor, leading to increasingly sophisticated understanding of materials science and engineering principles. Religious and ritual dimensions of weapons culture were reaching new levels of complexity. Many societies were developing elaborate ceremonies around weapon blessing, warrior initiation, and the retirement of weapons that had served with distinction. Some cultures treated certain weapons as sacred objects that possessed spiritual power and required special handling and storage procedures. The emergence of professional armies equipped with standardized weapons was beginning to reshape political structures across the ancient world. Kings and chieftains who could afford to maintain large numbers of well-equipped warriors gained decisive advantages over rivals who relied on traditional militia forces. The economic resources required to support these military innovations were driving the development of more sophisticated taxation and administrative systems. As Iron Age civilizations reached their peak around 500 BCE, the weapons they produced represented achievements in metallurgy, engineering, and craftsmanship that wouldn't be surpassed for over 1,000 years. The Roman gladius, the Greek kopis, the Celtic longsword, and dozens of other weapon types had achieved levels of functional perfection that made them the standard equipment for professional warriors across the known world. The cognitive abilities that had enabled humans to develop these sophisticated weapons were now being applied to challenges far beyond warfare. The same minds that had learned to forge steel were designing aqueducts, amphitheaters, and road systems that still inspire admiration today. The organizational skills developed through managing weapons production were creating administrative systems capable of governing vast empires. The social cooperation that had been refined through centuries of military innovation was enabling unprecedented achievements in art, literature, philosophy, and science. The disciplined thinking required to master complex weapon technologies was contributing to intellectual developments that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. Standing at this crucial juncture in human history, we can see that the story of weapons development had become inseparable from the broader story of human civilization itself. Every innovation in military technology had driven corresponding advances in metallurgy, engineering, economics, and social organization. The weapons that had emerged from millions of years of evolutionary pressure were now the tools that were building the foundations of the modern world. The journey that had begun 4.7 million years ago with a shaped stone was approaching its ancient climax. But the principles established through this incredible odyssey of innovation would continue to drive human achievement in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. The same creative intelligence that had transformed vulnerable primates into apex predators was about to tackle challenges that would reshape not just human society, but the planet itself. But as impressive as these Iron Age achievements were, they were merely the foundation for what would become humanity's most transformative leap in weapons technology since the invention of projectile hunting. Around 1000 CE, in the workshops of Chinese alchemists mixing sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter in search of immortality elixirs, an accidental discovery was about to render thousands of years of metallurgical expertise suddenly obsolete. The first gunpowder weapons were crude affairs that would have seemed laughable to a master swordsmith. Bamboo tubes packed with explosive powder that were as likely to kill the user as the target. Simple fire lances that shot flames and projectiles in roughly the same direction with accuracy that made a thrown rock seem precise by comparison. But within these primitive devices lay the seeds of a revolution that would transform not just warfare, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The cognitive leap required to harness explosive force for projectile weapons was staggering in its implications. For millions of years, human weapons had been limited by the physical strength of the user. The fastest arrow, the most powerful spear thrust, the deadliest sword stroke, all were constrained by the muscles and reflexes of individual warriors. Gunpowder shattered these limitations, creating weapons whose power came not from human strength, but from controlled chemical reactions that could be scaled almost infinitely. Archaeological evidence from early gunpowder weapon sites in China shows the rapid evolution of designs as smiths and alchemists worked to harness this new technology. The progression from simple fire lances to true cannons happened within just a few generations, representing a pace of innovation that was unprecedented in the history of weapons development. Each iteration solved specific problems while creating new challenges that drove further experimentation. The metallurgical demands of gunpowder weapons pushed iron-working technology to its absolute limits. Bronze Age smiths had worked with pressures measured in pounds per square inch. Early cannon makers were dealing with forces that could exceed several tons per square inch, pressures that would instantly destroy any weapon made with traditional techniques. The development of stronger alloys, better casting methods, and more sophisticated boring techniques required entirely new approaches to metalworking. But the real revolution wasn't just technological, it was psychological and social. For the first time in human history, weapons existed that could kill trained warriors regardless of their skill, experience, or physical conditioning. A peasant with a basic firearm could potentially defeat a knight who had spent decades mastering swordsmanship and mounted combat. The implications for existing social hierarchies were staggering and immediately recognized by ruling elites. The knowledge systems required to produce effective gunpowder weapons were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Where traditional weapons required understanding of materials and mechanical principles, firearms demanded expertise in chemistry, ballistics, and precision manufacturing. The margin for error in gunpowder composition was razor thin. Too little sulfur and the powder wouldn't ignite reliably. Too much saltpeter and the explosion could destroy the weapon. The proportions had to be exact, and the mixing process required techniques that were as much art as science. Regional variations in gunpowder weapon development were emerging as different cultures adapted the technology to their specific military needs and manufacturing capabilities. The Chinese developed massive siege cannons that could breach walls that had been considered impregnable for centuries. The Arabs created portable hand cannons that could be used by individual soldiers in field combat. European smiths focused on improving accuracy and reliability, creating firearms that could be mass-produced for infantry formations. Each of these approaches required different solutions to the fundamental challenges of gunpowder weapons. Controlling the explosive force, achieving consistent ignition, managing recoil effects, and maintaining accuracy over distance. All demanded innovations that pushed contemporary technology to its limits. The trial and error process was literally explosive, with failed experiments often resulting in death or serious injury for the experimenters. The social organization required to support gunpowder weapon production was creating entirely new forms of economic and political structure. Unlike traditional weapons that could be produced by individual craftsmen working with basic tools, firearms required industrial-scale operations with specialized facilities, complex supply chains, and coordinated teams of workers with different technical skills. The capital investment needed to establish cannon foundries was beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest kingdoms and city-states. Master gunpowder makers were emerging as a new class of technical specialists whose knowledge was both incredibly valuable and extremely dangerous. These individuals possessed understanding of explosive chemistry that could be used for construction or destruction, for creating weapons or mining operations, for building empires or bringing them down. The security implications of this knowledge were recognized immediately, leading to elaborate systems of secrecy, loyalty oaths, and protective measures. The training systems required to master gunpowder weapons were fundamentally different from traditional martial arts. Where swordsmen spent years developing muscle memory and reflexes, gunners needed to understand ballistics, trajectory calculation, and precision measurement. The mathematical knowledge required for effective artillery use was pushing military education toward academic disciplines that had previously been confined to scholarly pursuits. Evidence from early gunpowder weapon sites shows that successful military organizations were beginning to employ what amounted to military engineers, whose primary role was optimizing weapon performance through systematic experimentation. These technical specialists were developing standardized procedures for powder mixing, projectile design, and accuracy testing that represented some of the earliest examples of scientific method applied to weapons development. The standardization of gunpowder weapons was happening at unprecedented speed compared to earlier weapon technologies. Within a few centuries, cannon designs had converged on optimal proportions and manufacturing techniques that would remain essentially unchanged for hundreds of years. This rapid standardization was driven by the unforgiving nature of explosive weapons, where design flaws could result in catastrophic failures that eliminated unsuccessful approaches through natural selection. The economic implications of gunpowder weapons were reshaping trade relationships and political alliances across the known world. The raw materials needed for gunpowder production, particularly saltpeter, were available only in certain regions, creating new forms of strategic dependence. Nations that controlled saltpeter deposits or had access to reliable sources gained decisive military advantages over rivals who lacked these resources. The transportation and storage of gunpowder created logistical challenges that were unlike anything military organizations had previously encountered. Unlike traditional weapons that were essentially permanent once created, gunpowder was consumable, potentially dangerous, and required careful handling under all conditions. Military campaigns now required elaborate supply trains carrying not just food and equipment, but explosive materials that could detonate if mishandled. Religious and cultural reactions to gunpowder weapons were intense and varied. Some societies embraced the technology as a gift from the gods that would enable them to defend their territories more effectively. Others viewed firearms as unholy devices that violated natural law and traditional codes of honorable combat. The psychological impact of weapons that killed through invisible force rather than direct physical contact challenged fundamental assumptions about courage, skill, and warrior virtue. The development of portable firearms was beginning to blur the distinctions between military and civilian applications of weapons technology. Unlike swords or spears that were primarily tools of warfare, guns could be used for hunting, pest control, and personal protection in ways that made them valuable to non-military populations. This dual-use nature was creating new markets for weapons production while also raising concerns about social control and public safety. armor technology was struggling to adapt to the new realities of gunpowder weapons. The protective equipment that had evolved over centuries to defeat edged weapons and projectiles was largely useless against firearms. Early attempts to create bulletproof armor resulted in suits so heavy they were impractical for combat use, leading to the gradual abandonment of traditional protective gear in favor of mobility and firepower. The tactical implications of gunpowder weapons were forcing military organizations to completely rethink their approaches to combat. The tight formations that had been effective against traditional weapons became death traps when exposed to cannon fire. The individual heroics that had characterized earlier warfare were replaced by coordinated unit tactics that emphasized discipline and training over personal skill and courage. Evidence from battlefield archaeological sites shows that gunpowder weapons were achieving casualty rates that exceeded anything seen in previous conflicts. The ability to kill multiple enemies with single shots was creating new concepts of military efficiency and cost-effectiveness that would influence strategic thinking for centuries. Wars were becoming more decisive, but also more destructive, with outcomes determined as much by industrial capacity as military skill. The knowledge transfer systems that had sustained traditional weapons technologies for millennia were being disrupted by the rapid pace of gunpowder weapon development. The apprenticeship programs that had preserved metallurgical and crafting techniques across generations were inadequate for technologies that were evolving within decades rather than centuries. New forms of technical education were emerging that emphasized theoretical knowledge alongside practical skills. As gunpowder weapons reached maturity around 1500 CE, they represented the culmination of humanity's most rapid technological transformation since the development of agriculture. In just 5 centuries, weapons technology had advanced more than it had in the previous 5 millennia. The implications for human civilization were staggering and immediately apparent to contemporary observers. The same creative intelligence that had enabled our ancestors to shape the first stone tools was now harnessing the fundamental forces of chemistry and physics to create weapons of unprecedented power. The journey that had begun 4.7 million years ago with desperate experiments on the African savanna had reached a turning point where human weapons technology was beginning to rival the forces of nature themselves. But even as gunpowder weapons achieved dominance on ancient battlefields, the principles established through millions of years of weapons development continued to drive innovation in ways that would transform not just military technology, but every aspect of human civilization. The same problem-solving abilities, the same drive for improvement, the same refusal to accept limitations that had carried our species from vulnerable primates to apex predators were about to tackle challenges that would reshape the planet itself and ultimately carry human weapons technology beyond Earth to the stars above. The bronze sword that had once seemed like the pinnacle of human achievement now appeared as crude as a stone axe compared to the cannons that were beginning to dominate battlefields across the world. But that bronze sword, and every weapon that had preceded it, had taught humanity the fundamental lesson that would enable all future achievements. Intelligence, creativity, and determination could overcome any limitation, solve any problem, and achieve any goal that human minds could conceive. The age of traditional weapons was ending, but the age of human technological dominance was just beginning. The journey that started with a shaped stone in the hands of our earliest ancestors was about to transform our species into something that would have seemed godlike to those first toolmakers, beings capable of reshaping matter and energy according to their will, armed with weapons that could split atoms and reach across the void of space itself. The musket ball tears through the morning mist with a crack that echoes across the battlefield like thunder. And in that single moment, you're witnessing the death of an entire way of life. The knight in his gleaming plate armor, who moments before had seemed invincible atop his warhorse, now lies crumpled in the mud. His sword, forged by masters whose techniques had been perfected over centuries, will never again taste blood. The age of individual heroics, of personal skill determining the outcome of battles, of weapons that were extensions of the human body and spirit, was ending with the acrid smell of gunpowder smoke. But standing there in that field, watching the last gasps of medieval warfare, you're not just witnessing an ending. You're seeing the birth of the modern world. The same cognitive revolution that had enabled our ancestors to chip the first stone tools was now only humans fought, but how they lived, work-eashing forces that would reshape not just how'd and understood their place in the universe. The musket in your hands represents more than just improved killing power. It's the physical manifestation of humanity's ultimate triumph over the limitations that had constrained our species for millions of years. Where Stone Age hunters had been limited by the strength of their arms, Bronze Age warriors by the sharpness of their blades, and Iron Age soldiers by their individual skill and courage, you now wielded weapons whose power came from controlled explosions that could be scaled almost infinitely. The transformation wasn't just technological, it was psychological. For the first time in human history, weapons existed that made traditional notions of warrior aristocracy obsolete. The peasant conscript with 3 weeks of musket training could kill the noble knight who had spent his entire life mastering swordplay and horsemanship. This democratization of deadly force was shattering social hierarchies that had existed for millennia, creating new concepts of citizenship, equality, and individual worth that would echo through the ages. The knowledge systems required to produce these revolutionary weapons were fundamentally different from anything that had come before. Where traditional smiths had worked with techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen, gunpowder weapon makers were dealing with chemistry, ballistics, and precision manufacturing that required understanding of natural laws rather than inherited traditions. The margin for error was razor thin and often explosive. Literally, archaeological evidence from early firearms production centers shows the incredible pace of innovation as different cultures raced to perfect this new technology. Within just a few generations, weapons evolved from crude bamboo tubes that were as dangerous to their users as their targets to precision instruments capable of accurate fire at distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier warriors. Each iteration solved specific problems while creating new challenges that drove further experimentation. So here we are, at the end of humanity's longest and most successful experiment. From that first desperate moment 4.7 million years ago, when our ancestor picked up a stone and realized it could be something more, to the musket that would reshape the world, we've traced the incredible journey of human weapons evolution. Every innovation, every breakthrough, every leap forward was driven by the same relentless creativity that transformed us from vulnerable primates into the most dangerous species the planet has ever known. The stone tools, the bronze swords, the iron spears, the gunpowder cannons. They're all chapters in the same story. The story of minds that refused to accept limitations, that saw solutions where others saw only problems, and that turned weakness into strength through sheer force of will and ingenuity. That same revolutionary spirit that enabled our ancestors to survive the Ice Age and hunt mammoth is still with us today. Still pushing boundaries, still reaching for the impossible. Boundaries, still reaching for the impossible.